Did former slaves see changes after the war? The answer is definitely a yes. During the war, Congress passed the Homestead Act, which gave very cheap land to settlers. Former slaves called exodusters traveled to Kansas for a new life. If you look at the image on the right, you'll see a poster. The purpose of this poster was to convince former slaves to move west. Life wasn't always easy, but they were able to get away from the violence and lack of opportunity in the South. Some black communities were established that provided opportunities as well. After the war, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau established public schools in the South. As a result, literacy rates rose tremendously. Black colleges also emerged. For example, the Tuskegee Institute was established by Booker T. Washington and provided technical and agricultural training. As a result of the 14th and 15th Amendments, thousands of former slaves began to vote, despite Klan intimidation. As a result, dozens of African Americans, including former slaves, were elected to office. Hiram Revels was the first African American elected to Congress, while John Roy Lynch was one of many former slaves who went to Washington to serve in Congress. By 1873, radical Reconstruction began to fall apart. That movement had accomplished more than anyone had dreamed of a few years earlier. However, problems began to arise. Republicans had assumed that the national economy would grow, thus allowing them to continue to fund Reconstruction. Unfortunately, an economic downturn or depression hit the United States in 1873. To make matters worse, newly elected Republican politicians in the South engaged in corruption during their time in office. Not only were Northern Republicans, including President Grant, preoccupied with the shock of economic depression, but many were unhappy with the corruption that had been growing in Southern governments. Overall, Northerners were growing tired of Reconstruction and began to lose interest. As a result, many of the old radical Republicans began to leave office or were voted out. Meanwhile, newly elected Republicans showed little interest in continuing the efforts of radicals like Thaddeus Stevens. Meanwhile, planters and ex-Confederates began to stage a massive takeover of Southern government. In 1872, ex-Confederates and plantation owners were allowed to return to political office and vote when Congress passed the Amnesty Act of 1872 without President Grant's objection. By 1873, more and more Democrats began to participate in elections against Southern radical Republicans who were easily voted out of office due to the corruption scandals that had been growing. Once in power, these newly elected Southern Democrats restored voting rights to more ex-Confederates and campaigned against, quote, Negro rule. But when force was necessary to regain power, Southern Democrats used it. White supremacist groups like the Klan continued to use intimidation to intimidate black voters. The new white governments that emerged were known as Redeemers. Redeemers wanted to return the South to the old ways. Once in power, they passed harmful legislation. This included reducing funding for the public schools, trying to disband the Freedmen's Bureau, passing new Jim Crow laws that discriminated against African Americans, passing literacy tests and poll taxes to limit the black vote. All of these things eventually allowed Southerners to strengthen their hold politically, socially, and economically. President Ulysses Grant is sometimes criticized by historians for his legacy. However, Ulysses Grant did do quite a bit to advance the rights and freedoms of African Americans. He did support the 15th Amendment that protected the right to vote. He supported the Force Acts that did go after some white supremacist organizations, and he also supported the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which banned discrimination in public places. During riots in New Orleans in 1874, he sent federal troops to protect black voters, and he maintained troops in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. In states that did not have troops, voter intimidation grew. However, in 1875, after race riots occurred in Mississippi, when called on to send troops, he chose not to because he feared it would hurt the Republicans' ability to win Congress. He also did not vote down the Amnesty Act, which allowed ex-Confederates back into office. Reconstruction came to an end in 1877. It began in 1876 when President Grant decided not to run for president. The Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes to run against Democrat Samuel Tilden. As you can see in the chart on the right, Tilden actually won more popular votes, but the two tied in the Electoral College vote. This resulted in the House of Representatives having to break the tie with their own vote. Also, look at that chart and notice how Hayes won the states of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, mostly because Grant maintained troops in those states that protected African Americans in their attempts to elect another Republican. After the tie, leaders of the two parties worked out an informal deal that was known as the Compromise of 1877. The Southern Democrats would vote for Hayes in return for the following things. Hayes promised to pull all troops out of the South and end federal support for Republicans in the South. He also agreed to support the creation of a transcontinental railroad in the South. Shortly after becoming president, Hayes ended military rule and promptly withdrew the last of the federal troops who were protecting African Americans and other Republicans. Reconstruction was officially over and Democrats had seized political control of the South. Supporters of this new South promised a future of industrial development, but most Southern African Americans and whites in the decades after the Civil War remained poor farmers and they fell further behind the rest of the nation. So this is a great political cartoon from the era. If you notice, on the left, we see President Grant in a carpet bag carried by a woman dressed in white who represents the South. The carpet bag represents Northerners who traveled down south during the Reconstruction era to purchase land or create a new opportunity for themselves. They were known by Southerners as carpetbaggers. In the video you're going to see later, one of those carpetbaggers was named Walter Twitchell. He moved to South Carolina, and as a Republican, he faced quite a bit of violence. In the background, we see destruction and devastation in the South. The cartoonist believes that Grant's policies were actually oppressive and hurtful to the South. The other part of the cartoon portrays Hayes as a farmer plowing over that bag. The cartoonist is arguing that Hayes' policies were much more beneficial to the South. In the background, you can see farms and industry emerging. So, once Democrats regained control of government, especially at the state level, these new governments passed Jim Crow laws. Basically, they're just new forms of black codes. And these laws prevented blacks from sitting with whites in restaurants, on buses, and on trains. And the federal government really didn't enforce these laws in the 1870s, 80s, and all the way into the 90s. Although African Americans did have public education, the schools were inferior to white private schools. Most white families did not educate or send their students to these public schools. Instead, private schools were the dominant form of education. Jim Crow laws had a very harmful effect emotionally on African Americans. Basically, it created a sense of inferiority. African Americans for decades were conditioned to accept oppression. Beginning in the 1870s, the Supreme Court began to strike down civil rights laws. In the civil rights cases of 1883, the court ruled that Congress could not force citizens to integrate their hotels, restaurants, and other businesses. The Supreme Court argued that the 14th Amendment only protected citizens from discrimination by the federal government. In 1896, the court legalized segregation in the Plessy v. Ferguson case. An African American named Homer Plessy refused to move to the back of a train car. Like Rosa Parks, he was arrested and convicted of breaking local Jim Crow laws. He took his case to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was legal as long as facilities were equal. In 1898, the Supreme Court upheld laws legalizing literacy tests. This continued the trend of limiting the voting rights of African Americans. It wasn't until 1965 when civil rights laws were finally enforced across the country. During this time, African Americans could not sit on juries. This resulted in stiffer penalties for blacks, and crimes went unpunished. Lynch mobs killed 1,400 men in the 1890s. In fact, lynching grew became an epidemic into the new century. Unfortunately, no one was arrested or sentenced because most of the juries were biased. Now that you're done with the lecture, I want you to watch the video that I've posted. Watch the film for about 20 minutes, and when you're done, I want you to just kind of answer the question that you see in front of you. How would you grade the U.S. government for their efforts during the Reconstruction era? Did they do enough to advance the ideals of freedom, opportunity, and rights?